Welcome to the React course. I'm super excited for this course. It's been in the making for quite a long time. I know a lot of people have been waiting for it. Before we get into the actual content and kind of how the course is going to be laid out, I'd like to share a little bit something with you. We're all going to be starting this kind of on the same page, and I'd like you to kind of picture what it would be like to be in a front-end developer interview. Something probably like what I went through, something like this. Welcome to the interview for the super happy, awesome web developer position as a full stack engineer at our organization. Yeah, thanks. I'm super excited to be here. Thanks for having me. I actually applied to this company because I know that you guys make some super awesome products, hence the name, and kind of have really good reviews from your different developers that work here. I actually got a referral from one. Super excited to actually get through this interview together. I also did some digging on the side and I noticed that you actually built your website, looks like in React, so I can't wait to help join that team. Our website is built in WordPress. Ooh. Well, I guess that's why I'm here, right? Right. So let's just get to the first question. What is React? Yeah, sure. So React is a way to build websites. Right. Can you go into a little bit more technical detail on that? Sure. There's some JavaScript and some HTML and some CSS. I love all of them. They're a great way to actually build, don't say it, websites. All right, so hopefully you all found that kind of entertaining. I mean, a lot of interviews do go that way and you definitely don't have to fret it. The whole point of me showing you that was that I'd like you all to start kind of at a fresh start, right? On the same page so that we all can kind of go into this React course together from the same starting point where we really don't know very much apart from JavaScript, HTML, and a bit of CSS. So the goal of this React series is really to understand how React works in quite an amount of depth so that you can actually feel comfortable when you're in settings like that, in front of, for example, an interviewer or working on a project or working with a team or mentoring people, so that you can actually explain to yourself how things work inside of React and actually build web applications with less bugs and without worrying about kind of how to build it, but more about what it is that you're actually building. So without further ado, let's actually just get right into the content so I can show you what I have prepared for you. All right, so to start, I'd like to start with a definition for what React actually is. As you saw in that little interview clip that I had prepared, this is actually not a trivial question. In fact, in doing many interviews before, I've noticed that this is actually quite a tricky question for a lot of people to really get down. Now, of course, you're not probably going to prepare or have this in front of you when you're in an interview or when you're trying to explain to other people. But if you think of React in this way that I'm about to explain to you, hopefully it makes a bit more sense, even when it's come relative to other frameworks and other tools and technologies that you might be using, whether it's React or Angular or Swift UI or whatever it happens to be, they all kind of work in similar ways. So let's take a look at kind of how React works. So React, really at its core, if we were to try to define it and break it down to its essence, is a JavaScript library for building declarative, reactive, component-based user interfaces. So that sounds like a whole bunch of word soup and mumbo jumbo. And if you're reading this and being like, oh my gosh, I thought this was like an introduction to React video. What is this guy going on about? I don't blame you. Okay, so the purpose of not only this video, but the entire course is to actually go through this particular definition and really tear it apart so that when you can come back here after going through it, you can actually be like, okay, like this makes a lot more sense. I can actually break this apart and explain it to someone else with every single word in here in detail. So let's take a look at what we mean one at a time here. So I've actually broken up kind of that sentence into kind of these building blocks that we can start tackling slowly. So React really at its core is a UI library. Okay, so UI is short for user interface. It is a way to build kind of what we see as the end user for different types of applications. And that application might be a web application, it might be a mobile application, it could be like a VR application or whatever, right? It's just a way for the user to interact, to interface with some kind of tool. So we're going to be building that interactive visual for the user to actually play with the thing that we're building, right? So it is a UI library. A lot of people call it a framework, and I don't want to get too deep into kind of the words of is it a framework, is it a library? It doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, I would lean towards it being a library mainly because it doesn't really restrict you from using other tools very easily. It doesn't really have everything built in that you need when it comes to other things like a framework normally would. So really, I would just call it a library, which is kind of one series of tools that you can choose to use or not use, and you can mix with other tools very easily. So React at its core has these fundamental ideas behind it, and we're going to look at these really quick. JSX, this is a way to actually extend JavaScript so we can actually do some HTML, some CSS, and some other things, I guess, technically inside of JavaScript. There's this idea of components, which we're going to look at again, and which allows us to break up our actual web app into, or UI into different kind of functions and surfaces to work with. There's this idea called composition, which sounds fancy, but really it's just putting together a bunch of things like Lego, which is really nice. This idea of reactive UI, which is this idea of kind of like state management and having our state in JavaScript actually show up when it changes in the UI both ways dynamically. And this is actually where the term React comes from, is this idea of a reactive UI. And then the fact that it's all declarative. And I'll kind of get into a bit more detail as to what that means kind of shortly in a second here. So let's kind of get right into things. The entire point of React is to allow us to write web applications in an easier to understand and more intuitive way. At its core, React allows us to build apps using what's called JSX, which I'll show you in a second, and this idea of components. So what does that really mean for us as developers trying to build web applications? Well, here I have an example of an actual web page. This is a very simple web page. You can see that there's kind of a home page over here, and I've split it up into different what are called components. So over here in blue, I have a nav bar, I have a sidebar over here, I have some main content, and in that main content, I have like a profile picture, a bio section, and an article. So most websites, if you actually look at them and you break them apart, you could probably extract these higher level ideas of components. There might be things that are translatable across web pages, for example, a navbar or a sidebar, and there might be things that are unique to individual web pages, like for example, an article or a profile picture. Some of these might actually be used across different web pages in different ways slightly, and they might change depending on your mobile or if you're on a desktop, and other things like that. So really, it's quite complicated to look at an entire website and figure out, oh my gosh, like how am I going to build this thing? Like what's all the inner HTML and the text content and what kind of nodes am I going to use? Is it a div? Is it this? Is it that? It's much easier to be like, okay, I'm going to start with how to build, this particular section, for example, the navbar, and I'm going to isolate that and just work on that. So that's what we call a component in React and in many other frameworks as well. And it allows us to take these components and build them independently or actually couple them together so they can work in unison together. So really, at its core, React allows us to abstract away this idea that we have many different components like Lego to build up a full website, and we can reuse these components in different parts on different pages if they are very similar, which is really, really nice. And we do this all through something called JSX. So over here, I have some code that I wrote, and I just want to compare kind of what we see in the DOM API and the React API. If you haven't seen the DOM API before, I have a course on the channel about that, the DOM in depth. Definitely check it out if some of this looks confusing to you. But effectively over here on the left, I have a function which will create a navbar kind of node in a DOM tree, which is going to be an unordered list, a UL. And it's going to be attaching a bunch of things to this UL, and we're going to get back kind of a node in this DOM tree that's going to be a UL with 3 LIs as children. Now, the code on the left looks kind of confusing, right? Like maybe you could probably look through this and be like, okay, I kind of get it. That makes sense. But I'd like you to compare the code on the left, in this case, to the code on the right. The right is a React way of doing the exact same thing. So I'm creating a navbar component on the right in React. And what's weird is that I've actually kind of put this like HTML over here inside of what looks like JavaScript. which is really confusing at first glance. And this is what is called JSX. We're going to go in depth into JSX in future videos in this series, but just so that you have an idea intuitively as to what a component is and what JSX actually is, this is a good example of a comparison of the two side by side and what you can do in the DOM versus how you would do the same thing in React at a very basic fundamental level. At a high level as well, what this is doing is creating a navbar component in this case, which has these 3 links, and we can actually use this in different parts of our application depending on where we need to show the navbar, which is really nice. That leads me to the second idea, which is what is called component composition or just composition. This is a popular idea used in many tools and libraries and frameworks and even languages. And what this allows us to do is to what is called compose these different components together to create other components. So what does that mean? Imagine I had this home page over here. What I'm doing over here is I'm actually taking the navbar that you saw in the previous example and another component I created called the input component, which has a few things inside of it, and I'm actually putting them into the home page. So at a high level, I can say that this home page has a div with a navbar and an input in it. Those navbars and inputs are more complex components that have components inside of them, as we saw previously, like ULs and LIs and input elements and texts and labels and stuff like that. But we can actually abstract that one level higher and actually put these things together beside the homepage and start stacking them or moving them in different positions so that we can compose them into a higher level component. Now, the left is a DOM API, which actually doesn't look too bad if you actually look at it. Now, but what I have for comparison, as with the previous slide, is the React API on the right-hand side as well. You can see that this is a little bit easier to kind of understand. And in this case, we could actually probably go even a little bit further, and I could actually create a JSX version of these. But I just want to show you that really calling these functions is actually the exact same thing. So over here, if I really wanted to, I could turn these into actually like pseudo elements using the JSX syntax, which we'll see in future videos. Okay, now I'd like to get to one of the most important parts of React, which is this idea of a reactive UI. This, in fact, is so important that this is where the actual name of React comes from. All of that stuff that I showed you previously is actually used in many other libraries as well, right? So for example, this idea of having like JSX and component composition and components, many other libraries use that method. So it's not really unique to React, although React kind of created it for the most part at the get-go. But React ties this with the idea of a reactive UI. So what does that mean? If I was to, for example, have a web page like this, where I have a search bar, and in the body of this kind of web page, I would have different search results pop up. You can think of something like Google, or maybe like Facebook or Instagram, those kinds of apps where you search for something, you get a bunch of results, and those results are formatted in a specific way, but they're all like relatively similar. So what I would want to do is to be able to actually change what's being shown in the web page as I type into that search bar. And this is the idea of a reactive UI, because I'm actually typing into the UI, I'm interfacing with the user elements that I created. And as a result, the actual interface that I'm seeing, the visuals, are actually changing. And this is fundamental to the idea of React, hence the reactive UI. It's actually quite challenging to do this with the DOM without React. There's a lot of things you have to do. You got to change inner HTML, you got to change text content, you have to keep calling different functions. But at its core, React really takes care of a lot of this for us behind the scenes. And we can kind of, as long as we use the certain functions that are available to us through React, we can actually make it work quite easily. So let me show you an example. On the left example, here I have, as previously, the DOM API version of this. Here I have, I believe it's a input element with a p tag below it. And what I want is so that when you type in this input, the paragraph text kind of matches what you're typing in the input box, right? So that's what I have here, and that's the input element I think I showed in the previous in the previous slides as well. I think you saw me, for example, use input like right here. So that's the input element. Over here is a React version of actually doing that. So the main key difference here is that I'm using the React functions, for example, in this case, useState, which we'll look at in a future video, to actually make it so that when you change this input, instead of adding an event listener like this over here, we're actually doing it the React way like this over here, and using what's called state, so that this P tag over here actually can change dynamically as we're typing in the input box. So this is actually doing exactly functionally the same thing as what's on the left, just using the React API instead of the DOM API. Now you might be looking at this and be like, oh, that's actually kind of more challenging, a bit harder. I actually kind of like the left one a little bit more. The right one, I can probably learn it, but it's not great. And that's fine. I probably would have the same sentiment at first glance as well. It turns out though, when you start combining all of these concepts together, when you start combining the state and reactive UI and composition and components and stacking these components on top of each other, as well as many other ideas that we're going to look at in future videos that are a bit more advanced, these things actually get quite complicated quite quickly. For example, imagine if we had to change the state of something all the way over here, and then we had to update a bunch of stuff in the navbar and the sidebar and the profile all at the same time. Keeping all of that in sync can get quite complex quite quickly and could lead to a lot of bugs if we're not very careful. And all of the frameworks and UI libraries that have been coming out over the years, ever since JavaScript was really invented, have been trying to ease that burden on the developers so that we have less bugs in our applications, and we can develop applications a bit quicker and easier and actually have more fun doing it. So React is one of those newer libraries that allows us to do that, and there are many more like it. But this course is going to be focused on React since it's definitely the most popular right now. That said, I do want to focus on a couple of alternatives. There are many alternatives to React. As I kind of hinted at in that little little interview that I did at the start of the video, there is more to life than React, and I would highly implore you to learn vanilla JavaScript, so just regular old JavaScript. I have a series on how to learn that in depth on the channel as well as the DOM, in order to understand kind of what's happening behind the scenes, as I mentioned, in React itself. There are many other frameworks and tools like React libraries, like Angular, for example. You might have heard of it, Svelte, Vue. There's some newer ones like Remix. There's all sorts of ones coming out. In fact, it feels like there's one coming out almost every month these days. But at its core, if you can understand how React works, especially when it turns to how the DOM works behind the scenes and how the JavaScript of it all works behind the scenes as well, you have a better understanding for how websites really ought to work and how these tools really just add more and more abstractions or ways for us to think about how to develop these applications in an easier way on top of these fundamental tools below them. So really, learning React will actually help you learn a lot of these other tools as well once you know vanilla JavaScript as well as a bit of the DOM APIs. So what are we actually going to look at in this course together? I apologize, this isn't the most beautiful slide in the world, but I really want to visualize this a little bit. So this is kind of read from kind of top to bottom, left to right kind of thing. We have a lot of topics to cover together in this course, and I'm super excited to actually get through all of them. I really love working with React, and I really want to help others understand kind of some of those tough questions, even something as tough as what is React in the first place, which seems trivial, but is really not. We're going to start with some setup. In the next video, we're going to look at things like JSX. We're going to look at different components and events. We're going to look at all those fancy things that I talked about, like composition and stateful and stateless and reactive UI. We're going to look at lots of different hooks, as well as some really common things that people do in React, like data fetching, form validation, routing, and even things like custom hooks and some more advanced techniques as well. I really can't wait to get to this content. Each of these, for the most part, is probably also going to have exercises associated with them, and I probably will add either one or two different projects throughout this course so that we can actually get a better understanding of how to put all of this together in a much larger application. So I can't wait to get to this content. I'll see you in the next video where we're going to look at the setup for this and the tools that we need to actually start coding in React and get our first app actually up and running before we can actually start looking at things like how JSS works. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'd love to hear in the comments what you thought of the video or that little skit that I did at the beginning. Is there any topics that you don't see on here that you'd like me to cover? And just in general, kind of what are your thoughts on React, and what are some things that you've maybe struggled to actually understand you'd like me to cover in more depth? Until the setup video, I'll see you later. Bye-bye.